Okay, hello and welcome to the slideshow on critical interpretations from a psychoanalytical viewpoint. This is probably one of the trickiest and most daunting, I think, critical viewpoints to engage with, but it is something with a little bit of reading, a little bit of thought, I think most students can actually start to engage with on some level quite successfully, and it will enrich your understanding, I think, of literary texts and literary characters, as well as authors. So, a little bit of background. Psychoanalysis is quite a big, broad-ranging term, but the founding father of psychoanalysis was a guy called Sigmund Freud, who was a neurologist, and he lived between 1856 and 1939, and he had a huge impact on the beginning of the 20th century and the way people thought about human beings and the way that human beings think and how they form personality. He founded what became known as psychoanalysis as a form of therapy for psychological problems. So his famous image of him talking to someone lying on a couch is probably the image most people think of when they think about psychoanalysis and Freud. So he was a neurologist who saw the importance of actually human beings talking about their psychological problems to someone who would listen and try and analyse and come up with some way of solving those problems. What did he believe about the human mind? Well, he believed that human nature was primitive, and becoming adult involved a series of struggles to control this primitive side. So some psychologists see it as kind of us having three different brains. We have the brain that, maybe apes had. We have reptilian brains. We have also human brain, which kind of manages the more complex forms of communication and thought. So Freud really, on a similar level, believes that the mind is kind of struggling to control this inner primitive being. And he believed that we repress, that means hold down, primitive urges, and they come out and reveal themselves in dreams, unconscious actions, or parts of our speech. Freudian slips is a term that describes when we say something maybe by mistake that reveals something, according to Freud, about our deep primitive thoughts. What do I mean by primitive thoughts? Well, it could be that, you get angry with someone and you attack them. So think of that primitive part of human nature as being, you're in a caveman or you're in an animal. I think, fight or flight is a kind of common term that's used by therapists and psychoanalysis analysts as well. So it's that idea that we manage a primitive inner part of ourselves. Freud is not the only person who comes up with the theories of human personality, and he was criticised by other thinkers because he focused too much on sex. He thought that sexual desire was behind a lot of the neuroses, the struggles and problems that human beings had as they formed their own personalities. So not all people later on sort of bought into his ideas, but they are full of really interesting ways of looking at human character and psychology. So, what's some key terms that are really quite important, and they do sound a bit scary, a bit clinical, but some key terms that are really important in understanding some of Freud's thinking. One of them was the id, which, as you can see in the diagram, the picture on the left, is part of the mind that is driven by our primitive urges. So the id would be the part of your mind that wants to attack someone that sat on that seat on the bus and it was the last one and you wanted to sit there. So you might feel anger and aggression, but then you might manage that, okay, and actually stand up for the bus journey. Let's hope you do. The ego is really part of the mind that deals with reality. So that's the part of the human mind that we kind of voice to the rest of the world and to ourselves to an extent. Okay, so the id would be hidden or controlled by us. And the part that does or struggles to do the controlling, which manages the id and the ego, or the path between the two, would be called the superego. So that's part of the mind that enforces rules and imposes guilt on us. We shouldn't do that. So on the bus, you're feeling aggressive because somebody's taken a seat. The superego would be the part of the mind that says, hang on a minute, that's not the end of the world. It's a short bus journey. It'll manage your behaviour, and your ego will perhaps go, hey, it's not too much to worry about really. I'll just I'll stand here and I'm sure I'll get a seat the next journey I take. The term unconscious is really important. The unconscious is the part of the mind that we usually keep hidden. So as you can see in the diagram, that's certainly the id is a big part of our unconscious. The superego and the ego, though, are partly unconscious and partly preconscious. So they kind of merge into a more sort of closer relation to the conscious mind, what we actually voice. Repression just means where the ego prevents unwanted desires entering conscious thought. So the ego would repress and hold back certain things. So in the preconscious state, the ego holds back certain things that it doesn't think should be voiced. Probably one of Freud's most famous concepts, and as I said, a lot of people criticised him because of his obsession with sexual urges, but the Oedipus complex, I can't really not mention that if we're talking about psychoanalytical thought and Freud. He believed it was the primitive urge to develop sexual relations with a mother figure and to attack and destroy a father figure. So he thought that was a primitive urge that young people had as they grew up, and it was something they had to come to terms with and manage. Okay, and a successful adult would be someone who managed that and came to terms with it. So those are some ideas. I hope that hasn't scared you too much. It does sound the language quite daunting in places. But again, we'll ask the question, what's this got to do with reading novels, plays and poetry? Well, again, I would say it can be, not always. And I think if you find it sort of really complicated and you get yourself in a muddle, I would avoid engaging with this. But it can be a really, really useful way of engaging with a literary text. So, psychoanalytical critics believe that literature, novels, poems and plays reflect the minds of the writers that produce them, and also present us with characters who reflect the psychological struggles real human beings deal with. So a sophisticated reader of literature might be a reader who considers, what role does psychology play in a text? How does the writer present characters' psychological states? Are they happy? Are they unhappy? Do they seem extreme in their behaviour? How do characters reveal repressed primitive desires in the way that they act and speak in the text? So what are the desires that they seem to be holding back or perhaps giving vent to? In what ways does the work reflect the ideas of Freud, or does it seem to contradict them? Freud focused on this struggle between the id and the superego and the ego. Maybe there's another way that you can see the writer is dealing with how psychology works. That's a little bit tricky to consider, but it might be something that higher ability students engage with. Does the work reflect aspects of the writer's own personality and psychology? So that's a really interesting way of looking at a text, is actually seeing the characters within the text as manifestations of or parts of the writer's personality. So if a character is struggling with a particular psychological problem, is that really reflecting something about the writer's own personality? The more you learn about the background of a writer and their life and their relationships, the more that becomes something that you can engage with. Okay, so onto an example of how you might use psychoanalytical sort of theory and language to engage with the text. I'm going back to Macbeth. If you haven't read Macbeth, the play, or seen it before, it does involve the character Lady Macbeth, who conspires with her husband to kill a king and then take power. And then at the end of the play, spoiler alert, she starts sleepwalking, shows some kind of internal guilt, and ends up killing herself because of what her and her husband have done. So this is talking about a quote that she says while she's sleepwalking. The spot, it refers to a spot of blood. So sentence starters I've got there, which are quite basic, but they allow you to engage with some sort of level of psychological sort of language. I think the quote reveals psychology the character is. I feel this may give us an insight into the subconscious of the writer, suggesting he, she is. The repressed desire of seems present in the text as. So those are some of the kind of ways that you might engage with a psychological reading. Here's my reading of that quote from Macbeth, or a possible psychoanalytical reading. I feel the presentation of Lady Macbeth encourages a psychoanalytical reading when she states out, damned, spot out in the opening of Act 5. I think this reveals that psychologically the character is deeply troubled, suggesting her guilt and the struggle in her unconscious mind between the superego and the id. Her primitive desire to kill Duncan and take power has resulted in a psychological crisis, which ultimately results in her taking her own life. So you can see from that I've used some of the key words and key terms of Freudian psychoanalytical thought to engage with the character's psychological state. Okay, as I said, it's quite a challenging form of critical interpretation, but simply using the word psychologically or repressed desire, those kinds of terms, and understanding that a character might reveal something primitive in their actions or speech, will be sort of engaging on a psychological level with a text.